Several years ago, I lived in Boston. And you may or may not know much about Boston, but one thing that's good to know about Boston is that it's a walkable city. People use public transportation, people use bicycles, people walk around. And so it's not uncommon to have to go somewhere and just walk instead of driving a car. Well, I remember there was this one particular time when I went up into this particular intersection and I was standing there and I was waiting for the cars to finish doing whatever they were doing so that I could cross the street safely. And I remember in that moment, standing at the corner and somebody coming around the corner to turn and see me and encouraging me to go past. So I began to walk across the street. When it hit me, I am actually basing my life right now off of the fact that this person told me to go ahead. In other words, what led me into walking into that street was that I believed that one thing was true, that this person who had just told me to go ahead was actually trustworthy, or that what they were saying was true. My decision was based off of truth. Truth impacts everything that we do in our lives. It's a part of everything, every one of our relationships. It's a part of what we do when we go to work. It's a part of what we think about ourselves. Truth, and oftentimes evidence, if that's something that even is applicable to us, are essential parts of us functioning and in working with each other as human beings. As a Christian, if I wanted somebody to understand truth about a person living in the past, what could I do? I could maybe say, well, let's see if this person maybe wrote anything. We can look at what they wrote. Or maybe I can say, let's talk to some of their friends and see if some of their friends maybe wrote some things about them, or if their friends are still alive, maybe I can talk to them and get firsthand information about this person. Or maybe if this person lived a couple years ago, I could go visit their house and see maybe what is in their house and learn more about the person that way. In other words, there's a variety of ways in which I can get to know somebody who isn't alive right now. And when it comes to Christianity, oftentimes this is what we are presented when it comes to Jesus. I have not had a personal encounter with Jesus where he came and he stood right in front of me. And so I can't really engage in a visual kind of way in order to get to know him. But what I do have are writings. What I do have are things that friends have said about him. What I do have is historical documentation. What I do have are other things that help me to know more about who he was. Oftentimes people ask me, they say, Alycia, prove to me that there is a God. And it's like, well, that isn't necessarily how things work when it comes to belief. I can say that there are certain things that I can prove, but they tend to be mathematical concepts, right? Proof is a mathematical idea. But when it actually comes to things in life that we can prove, we actually come to belief in something obtaining like a variety of different methods and experiences and evidences that lead us to believe something is true, even though we may not be able to conclusively prove it. So here's an example. Let's say I have a friend of mine who is in a domestic violence situation, just a horrible situation where she's married to somebody who is just completely mistreating her and harming her. And so I call her up one day and she doesn't answer. And I call the next day and she doesn't answer. And I call the next day and she doesn't answer. So after a couple of days of this, I'm getting a little bit nervous. And so I go to her house and I knock on the door and I ring the doorbell and nobody comes. And I try the door handle and it opens. It's unlocked. And I'm like, okay. So I go in and as I go in, I look and I see the furniture is all disheveled and it seems like nobody's answering when I call out. And it looks like there may even be blood on the walls. Like something doesn't seem right here. In that moment, would it be irrational for me to pick up the phone and call the police and say, I think something has happened. Can you please come? I don't have proof that something has happened. I don't have proof that she's in harm's way. I mean, it could have been an animal that came in to ransack the house and she's off on vacation at the beach somewhere, right? I don't have proof that that's what happened here. But there's some things that are pointing here to me that are saying something isn't right. And nobody would call me irrational for calling the police based off of the things that I have laid out before me. And in fact, people would call me silly or maybe not very smart if I didn't call the police. They say that was so stupid of you to not call the police and have them come and take a look and do further investigation. For me, oftentimes I think of the case for Christianity somewhat like that. If you think about the idea of belief of God being in the middle, off of that are all of these different branches. So, for example, one branch might be the origins of the universe and how do we get here? One branch might be the fine-tuning of the universe and how it's so meticulously designed for life to exist. And one might be the idea that we have this sense of morality that we can't quite explain. It may not always be in agreement, but it is there. From culture to culture, there are certain things that are right and certain things that are wrong. Or maybe it's the sense that we have a desire for meaning in life. Or what about this Jesus character? Like, how do we even explain him and his entrance into history? And how do we explain the Bible? And the list can go on. And so for somebody like me, I think the case for God is based off of a culmination of many things. Just like with the friend. I walk into the house and I see a bunch of different clues that are leading me that something has happened. This is a plausible explanation that she might be in trouble. And when the police come, what will they do? They will come and conduct a more thorough investigation. They will talk to people. They will talk to eyewitnesses. They'll talk to neighbors. They'll talk to friends. They'll do cell phone records. And they'll be adding more things to this case so eventually we can find out what happened, hopefully, at least. And so in the short time today, what I'm going to do is not give you a comprehensive case for belief in God or specifically for Christianity. I don't have enough time for that. But I want to give you a few things that in spite of being well documented, in spite of them being well trustworthy things of this kind of puzzle that we have or this picture that we have, these are things that people still struggle to believe. And maybe it's worth us thinking through why would we struggle to believe them. So, for example, I can tell you a whole lot about Jesus before I ever even pick up a Bible. So I can actually take a Bible, lay it to the side, and say that I could tell you that Jesus existed, that he was a wise man, that he did good things, that he had followers, that he was crucified under a guy named Pontius Pilate, that something happened 3 days later, and he had followers called Christians long after his life. I don't need the Bible for those facts because I have documentation and external sources outside of the Bible that help give me that information. So here's just an example. A gentleman named Josephus, a well-known Jewish historian. He was not alive when Jesus was alive, but he was writing somewhere in the 70s to 90s AD. And here is what he wrote in a passage in his Jewish Antiquities. He writes, and I'm going to paraphrase it here, Jesus was a wise man. He talks about how he had many followers. He talks about how Jesus did good things. He talks about how Jesus was crucified and that it was Pontius Pilate who crucified him and that his followers are called Christians. We also have a gentleman named Tacitus who's basically one of the greatest and most respected Roman historians that we have. He was writing somewhere around, he lived from around 56 to 117 AD. Now keep in mind, Jesus' death happened somewhere around the 30s. So this is not that far after Jesus' death. And Tacitus is just a Roman historian. He is not a Christian. He talked about how there was a fire that occurred in Rome. And Nero, the emperor at the time, blamed it on the Christians. And he tortured the Christians. And the story tells us how he even lit Christians on fire and set them to kind of light up the town, basically, while they were being burnt. I mean, Nero was a horrific ruler. But Nero blames the fire that happened in Rome on Christians, where everybody's like, they think that Nero actually set the fire and blamed it on Christians. Why does that matter? Because it shows that Christians were around 80 years after Jesus' death. Tacitus also tells us that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate. It actually uses the word Christ, or Christus, suffered under Pontius Pilate. Additionally, we have the Babylonian Talmud, which is a completely Jewish writing. Now, the Jewish writings are not going to speak very favorably on Jesus. The Jewish writings are going to talk about how, he was a false Messiah, how his father was not God, but his father was a Roman soldier. So Mary actually fathered Jesus with a Roman soldier. But here's what the Babylonian Talmud does say as well. It says that Jesus was crucified on the eve of Passover. So Jesus' existence is really not something that we really need to debate. It's not really something that we need to be we need to wonder, is that our starting point? Our starting point is never, did he exist? Our starting point is always, who was he? Who was he? Interestingly enough, back in 1986, the Journal of American Medical Association, called JAMA for short, decided to undertake, from a medical perspective, what exactly the crucifixion of Jesus would have been like. And so they wrote a really interesting article called On the Physical Death of Jesus Christ. You could probably still read it online if you look up JAMA, J-A-M-A, March 1986, on the physical death of Jesus Christ. And you'll probably still see the PDF up there. But they walk through the different parts of the crucifixion story and try to understand from modern day medicine what would have happened to Jesus. Here's what's really interesting. When you read the biblical story, and it talks about in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus was there and he was praying. He knew it was going to happen. His disciples were not praying with him. They were falling asleep. They were not helping him. But he was under such duress because of what was to come, because he knew that he was about to be crucified and flogged, and the pain that he was about to endure. And it talks about how he was sweating blood. Well, one of the things that this journal article pointed out is this idea of sweating blood is called hemohydrosis, which is basically when you hemorrhage into your sweat glands under highly emotional stress. In other words, it's very plausible that this happened. They actually understand it now as a medical condition, something that the authors, would they have understood that who were writing the New Testament, or were they writing what actually happened? Were they writing to make something up? Or were they writing because that's actually what Jesus went through? And that's important because today, from a medical perspective, we've been able to understand that this is an actual medical condition. Additionally, in John chapter 19, it talks about how it was time for them to try and get these men off of the cross. And so they went around to try and break their legs to make them die faster. When they got to Jesus, as he was hanging on the cross, they went to break his legs and they realized he's already dead. And so the soldier puts his sword into Jesus' side, and the biblical text says outflows blood and water. Well, what's interesting is that as the article goes into, that would ultimately mean that what they did is they punctured his heart in the pericardial sac, which surrounds his heart. How would the early New Testament authors have known and understood that happens that when you're dead and you obviously puncture that pericardial sac, you are dead from that point on. Like, even if you weren't dead before, you're dead now. Like, Jesus' death, that he died on the cross, is a given. And so what's interesting is that how would these be things that New Testament authors would have made up if they wanted to make up a story, but yet be so right and accurate? It seems to me that both of these things are accurate examples of what Jesus went through that we are now able to understand medically. But additionally, if I was to talk to you about what happened after Jesus' death, we know that he died, but for Christians, that isn't the end of the story. And the simple reason is because it seems like nobody's ever found the body. Because it seems like Jesus' followers who, before he died, abandoned him, now after he died, all of a sudden are willing to give their life for him. Something changed for them. Something made them say, wait, I don't know about him, to all of a sudden, I'm willing to believe and give my whole life. They believe they saw the risen Jesus. They believe he did not stay dead, but he appeared to them and they saw him. And that changed everything for them. It changed James, Jesus' brother, whose family thought he was Looney Tunes before this. They had to, what is wrong with you? Why are you saying that you're this special Messiah person? You're just my brother. They didn't understand that. Obviously, Mary would have been in a different situation. But now all of a sudden, James is willing to, as Josephus tells us, actually the same Jewish historian, James ends up being martyred. James also writes the book of James. It changed him. We also know that there was a change in a Pharisee who hated Christians named Paul. But this gentleman seemed to become somebody different, drastically different, because he believed he encountered Jesus. The evidence for the resurrection is a much bigger kind of situation and case, and I've only given you a few small examples of it. But the important things that we need to understand is that nobody's ever been claimed to have been found. Nobody's ever said that they have the body. We know that he definitely died because we just talked about the pericardial sac. We know that the lives of his followers were changed afterwards. We know that the church grew very fast a couple of days because of what happened a couple of days after he died. So we know that there are all of these things that lead us, once again, to the most plausible explanation is that he did indeed rise from the dead. And these facts that I'm giving you are not facts that are just what Christians would believe. You are just talking about a basic historian or a basic scholar would actually affirm that these things happen. An empty tomb, a change in James, a change in Paul, the growth of the church. But even still, some of this is still oftentimes so hard for us to believe and understand. I remember I was speaking with a gentleman. This is a couple years ago now, and he was a scientist, I believe, maybe some like astrophysicist or something. I don't quite remember. But I remember him, he was an atheist. He was not a Christian. I remember talking to him and saying to him, hey, what is it that would take for you to believe in Christianity? And he said, I need a miracle. I want to see a miracle. So I said, all right, what if I can show you a real life miracle of a woman that I know, I've met her, that was in a wheelchair, paralyzed for 25 years, and she's at a church service, and they're praying over her, and she stands up and walks at the church service, and is still walking to this day. She went back home to her home in Buffalo, New York, and the Buffalo News was there because she wanted to walk up the stairs to her parents' house for the first time in 25 years with her own legs. If I could show you a miracle of somebody who was paralyzed now walking, would you believe? And the gentleman said to me, no, I wouldn't believe. Because I would just say that her brain spontaneously healed itself, or her body found a way to heal itself, or maybe there's an explanation that science will one day tell us. In other words, what I've found is even when I give people evidence, whether it's credible historical documentation about who Jesus was, whether it's an historical case for the resurrection of Jesus, whether it's evidence with miracles, people still say they don't want to believe. Why do we think that is? Well, part of it might be because we are in what's called a post-truth society. And I will admit that in this day and age, figuring out what truth is or what is true is such a difficult question. I mean, look at the social media world that we are in. You have Facebook, and you have Instagram, and you have TikTok, and you have all these news cycles, and you've got all these commentaries and podcasts. Like, we have so much coming at us, feeding us information, that it can be so hard to even know what is true. But in November of 2016, the Oxford Dictionary named post-truth their word of the year. And the word of the year is intended to sum up the previous year that in a single word. That's what they're intending to do. How do we sum up the previous year in a single word? Well, during the research, Oxford Dictionary editors discovered that the word post-truth increased by about 2,000% from 2015. And this increase was largely attributed to two things. It was attributed to Brexit, the Brexit referendum in the UK, and also the presidential election of Donald Trump in the U.S. when he actually secured the Republican nomination. So let me read you what post-truth is, and we'll talk about this a little further. This is how they would define it. They would say that post-truth is relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. I'll read that again. Post-truth is relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. In other words, people aren't as swayed by the truth. People don't care as much about facts. What is now effective to transform people and to believe in something is by telling people what they want to hear or what they wish was true or what they want to be true. And so what society essentially does is society encourages us to use our emotions and our feelings to make decisions and not fact. Why do they do this? Well, honestly, because oftentimes it's easier to believe what makes us feel good or what we want to be true rather than what actually is. I mean, think of the kid who just wants to eat a bowl of ice cream for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Okay? What's true is that it's actually not giving him the proper nutrients for his body, but the emotions and the facts say, or the emotions and the feelings say, eat it, eat it, eat it. That's what feels good. And so what's happened in the world of politics is politicians will go so far as to advocate for solutions to issues that they know are impossible to solve. But they just say it because it makes people feel good. Or people will ignite people's emotions on the campaign trail and make people upset and hurl accusations that aren't even true or make declarations that aren't even true. And they're just putting out a bunch of opinions and just saying a bunch of platitudes and just saying things that sound really profound and really great, even if there isn't any truth to them. And no matter how bad the moral failures may be of a person, those are belittled to say, well, that really wasn't that big of a deal. In other words, the truth about these things don't matter. Whether what they're advocating for can happen doesn't matter. Whether the things that they're saying, whether or not they're really true, that doesn't matter. What their actions and words are don't matter. All people care about is the end goal, and that's to win the political race. But we can't blame it fully on the political campaigns. The internet has made it very, very easy for people to fall victim to post-truth culture. With Twitter, Twitter, by the way, being able to put a whole statement in 280 characters, there's no room for citation in something that's short, right? So somebody can just say something and it is read as truth, or it is at least implanted in our minds as truth, but it doesn't necessarily mean it is, okay? What about Facebook? Facebook is a place where people just go back and forth, and now it's the opposite. You can write as much as you want. Well, I think this is this, and I heard this is this, and this should happen here. And then it just becomes a school of public opinion going back and forth, because who is true, who isn't accurate, how much of what somebody says is accurate, these are all things that we just don't even really know. And so now we're in an era where if you are popular or you have celebrity status or you are social media success or personality, we now think that you are true. We now think that you are credible. We now go to you for information. We now hold views and beliefs that you hold. You become the influencer for us. You be the one to tell us truth. You be the one to lead us and guide us. And so regardless of the credibility of the person, it's all about whether or not we see them as credible. Truth gets pushed to the side. And so now it's so easy to have a post-truth culture. We don't trust the media. We don't use encyclopedias anymore. We lack an internal fire and desire for truth. We would much rather prefer what we want to be true. Several years ago, some scholars and teachers at Princeton, Harvard, and Yale wrote a letter to incoming students about truth. I want to read you part of this letter. This is what it says. It says, think for yourself. Now, that might sound easy, but you will find, as you may have discovered already in high school, that thinking for yourself can be a challenge. It always demands self-discipline, and these days can require courage. In today's climate, it's all too easy to allow your views and outlook to be shaped by dominant opinion on your campus or in the broader academic culture. The danger any student or faculty member faces today is falling into the vice of conformism, yielding to groupthink. At many colleges and universities, what John Stuart Mill called the tyranny of public opinion does more than merely discourage students from dissenting from prevailing views on moral, political, and other types of questions. It leads them to suppose that dominant views are so obviously correct that only a bigot or a crank could question them. Since no one wants to be or be thought of as a bigot or a crank, the easy, lazy way to proceed is simply by falling into line with campus orthodoxies. Don't do that. Think for yourself. Oftentimes people We'll say, well, that's why I look to science. Because science will tell me what truth is. Science will tell me what to believe. Here is the problem with that, friends, is that science is great, and we should use science as much as we can in its area of specialty. But science can't tell us everything, nor is science the only way that we come to belief in things. So science, for example, can't tell us which woman in the room might be the prettiest, or whether red is a better color than blue. Science can tell us and help us come up with the technology to put a monkey in a spaceship and send that monkey to the moon, but science can't tell us whether or not we should. Science can't tell us what I did 3 days ago because science can't prove history. Why? Because science needs to be able to reproduce things over and over and over, and it cannot reproduce history. Science can't prove history. If I was to say to you, tell me that your mother's your mother, you might say things like, well, I've got pictures of her, and you might say, I know she's my mother because I have memories of her, and I remember when she made this thing, and I remember she came to this play that I did. And people wouldn't look at you and think that you were crazy for giving me those proofs as to why your mother's your mother. Nobody would look at you and say, you're a nutcase for thinking that was your mother because you never gave her a DNA test. No one would say that to you. Why? Because using a DNA test, using a scientific DNA test is not the only way for us to know whether or not your mother's your mother. You would have had confidence in that before you ever gave her the DNA test. The DNA test is only confirming what you already knew. But you didn't need that to know whether or not she was your mother. And nobody would call you irrational for not putting her through scientific scrutiny and saying, I'm not going to call you mom until I can give you a DNA test. So why do we do the same thing, but the same demands on God or on religion or on specifically Christianity? That is not the only way in which we come to understand and know things. And we need to remember that when we understand knowledge, it comes from a variety of different areas, and it comes from a variety of different sources of information. That happens in our day-to-day lives, and thankfully it happens also with Christianity. We have information about Christianity from a variety of places. So is the challenge that we don't want to believe in things unless we have scientific evidence? Is the challenge that there isn't enough evidence for Christianity, even though we may have, even when we have a miracle that's presented before us? Is it true that history doesn't confirm what we know to be true about Jesus, even though we have historical documentation? Are these really the hiccups that are causing us to not believe? Or maybe causing us to doubt or wonder? Or is it something else? I want to read you what C.S. Lewis said about his own conversion from atheism to Christianity. He said, when the line pulls at your hand, when something breathes beside you in the darkness, it's always shocking to meet life where we thought we were alone. Look out, we cry. It's alive. And therefore, this is the very point at which so many draw back. I would have done so myself if I could and proceed no further with Christianity. An impersonal God? Well and good. A subjective God of beauty, truth, and goodness inside our own heads? Better still. A formless life force surging through us, a vast power which we can tap? Best of all. But God himself? Alive? Pulling at the other end of the cord? Perhaps approaching at an infinite speed? The hunter, king, husband, that is quite another matter. There comes a moment when the children who've been playing at burglars hush suddenly. Was that a real footstep in the hall? There comes a moment when people who've been dabbling in religion suddenly draw back. Supposing we really found him. We never meant it to come to that. Worse still, supposing he had found us. I want to read you the rest of the quote from the Harvard, Princeton, and Yale professors. Here's how they finished up their statement to their students. Thinking for yourself means questioning dominant ideas even when others insist on their being treated as unquestionable. It means deciding what one believes, not by conforming to fashionable opinions, but by taking the trouble to learn and honestly consider the strongest arguments to be advanced on both or all sides of questions, including arguments for positions that others revile and want to stigmatize, and against positions others seek to immunize from critical scrutiny. The love of truth and the desire to attain it should motivate you to think for yourself. The central point of a college education is to seek truth and to learn the skills and acquire the virtues necessary to be a lifelong truth seeker. Open-mindedness, critical thinking, and debate are essential to discovering the truth. Moreover, they are our best antidotes to bigotry. Merriam-Webster's first definition of the word bigot is a person who is obstinately or intolerantly devoted to his or her own opinions and prejudices. The only people who need fear open-minded inquiry and robust debate are the actual bigots, including those on campuses or in the broader society who seek to protect the hegemony of their opinions by claiming that to question those opinions is itself bigotry. So don't be tyrannized by public opinion. Don't get trapped in an echo chamber. Whether you in the end reject or embrace a view, make sure you decide where you stand by critically assessing the arguments for the competing positions. Think for yourself. We need to ask ourselves, every one of us needs to ask ourselves, if we're willing to think for ourselves what just might be true, even if it means we might stumble upon a truth that we wish wasn't. As I wrap up here, many of you may have seen the movie The Matrix. It was a trilogy that came out years ago. And The Matrix is a really interesting movie. In this particular movie, people are living in this world and going about their day-to-day life. And what is reality to them actually isn't reality. What they don't realize is that they actually are part of a computer type world where they're actually hooked up in another place, and they think that they're moving around and doing all of these activities, but that actually isn't reality. They're kind of caught in this computer trap, this computer type world that is staged and made up and is controlled outside of them. Now, they don't know it, but there are a few in this world that do know that this world isn't real. One of them is a guy named Morpheus, and he has been on the lookout for this one. The one is going to help them. They need the one to help save them from this world that they're in. And so Morpheus has been on the lookout to find who the one is when he runs across a guy named Neo. And listen to what Morpheus says to Neo about the world that they live in. He says, the Matrix is everywhere. It's all around us. It's the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. What truth? That you're a slave. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch, a prison for your mind. And so there's a group of about, 8 or so people that are trying to break out of the Matrix, destroy the Matrix so that people can be freed again and no longer be under control of the computers. But one of the 8 decides that he would rather live in the Matrix. In other words, while he knows the system that he lives in is a lie and it's not real, he would prefer the lie than the truth. He'd prefer to stay in the system where he doesn't really have free will, where he's being controlled, than help them break free and destroy the system that's controlling them. Money, fame, they were better than the truth. The only way for people to be freed from this matrix and the enslavement of the computers is for Neo, the one, to sacrifice himself. And ultimately, Neo does. And after he does, 3 words are uttered. It is done. Neo sacrificed himself so that people could be freed from the world that they lived in that they didn't realize that they were in bondage to, or that was impacting their ability to see truth. Interestingly enough, over 2,000 years ago, Jesus came to this earth to let people on this earth know that there's more than this reality that you see around you. That you are a created being with value, that you are important, that there is a God who sees you and loves you, wants to free you even from yourself and the shame and humiliation you feel about yourself and the wrong things that you've done. But the only way for you to be reunited with the God, the only way for you to break free from the bondage you're in is for me, Jesus, to sacrifice myself. And so Jesus does. And when he does, 3 words he utters: it is finished. And then he dies. In this world, we oftentimes don't realize how often we would prefer the lie over the truth. Once you're outside of the particular system, it's easier to see, wow, this actually was better than what I was in before. But it's much harder to tell when you're on the inside of it. In the movie, in The Matrix, the only way that you'll be able to realize that you were in the Matrix was to begin to let your doubts go and to be open to embracing that something else might just be plausible. If you weren't even willing to consider that something else might be there, then you were going to stay trapped in the world that you were in. But if you were going to give yourself the opportunity to consider, you could be free from whatever it was that was clouding your eyes. So the question we must ask ourselves is, do I reject the truth because it really is a lie? Or do I reject the truth because I prefer the lie? And only you know the answer to that.